I see old barns as documents. And there's no other thing in the landscape that gives that sense of connection to the history and farming and agricultural activities of a bygone era.
Well, they came from England, they came from Germany, they came from Scotland. What happened was that first thing they realized is we have to build barns. This barn was built from scratch about 9 years ago. It's built much like our cabin is, so a lot of work went into this barn, and we have hewn walls, so they're flattened, exposes the center of the log, which is more rot resistant. In the corners, we use half dovetail notches, which are a very strong notch. There's no nails or pegs in it, it's just the weight of the logs will hold it together throughout the worst weather. The logs are all oak, so you could do much of the work ahead of time. So just one or two people could do most of the work. But when it came to actually erecting it, these logs weigh, some of them close to 1,000 pounds. And so it's going to take a lot of manpower to get them hoisted into place. And so we're not going to live in a one-room cabin for the rest of our lives. We're not going to have this tiny little cramped barn. We're going to eventually continue making improvements until we have a big red barn full of hay and a nice white house with a white picket fence.
We are in St. Anita's, Iowa. The significance of this building, it's arguably the oldest barn in the state of Iowa. We say arguably because someone came and said, well, our barn is older, and so that's why we say arguably the oldest barn in Iowa. A man by the name of Galen built it, 1839. These stones were from local quarries. How they got them up to 2, 3, 4 stories, I would like to know that myself. These buildings are standing as solid today as they did in 1840. The Luxemburgers were stonemasons for the most part, and this was a Luxembourg village. This is why some of us older people can still talk the language. Folklore has it that they did live up on this part. Their livestock was downstairs. Like when this family that was living here had their house built, they would move into their house, and another immigrant family would move in here till they had their house built. They were, shall we say, clannish people. They stuck together.
The simple definition of vernacular is of the folk. So it's folk architecture. It's architecture that's built by people who are not trained. The buildings are very much defined by tradition.
Farmers had those skills to be able to work and build a barn. That's not to say that there wasn't some degree of risk in those farmer operators building their own barn. That was that whole idea of thrift and being self-reliant. There was a story up in northwestern Iowa about a farmer who built a barn for $175 in 1888 or so because he was able to saw the lumber himself and build it with his neighbors.
A lot of people don't realize this, but America really did start as a lumber venture because the Iron Age had depleted wood so dramatically in the European nations and the English nations that they didn't have big, towering, straight, tall trees, because what we had here was big, tall, straight trees. So it changed the way we built barns immediately.
Therein lies a lot of the fascination of the craft for me as well. It's looking, anticipating, or speculating on what they did accomplish with what they had, both in terms of tools and raw resource as well.
I often hear people offhandedly say, it's really a shame that the virgin forest is gone, that no one can really enjoy the virgin forest anymore. Well, they're wrong. You want to come and see the virgin forest? Come with me, let's go out in some of the barns, and I'll show you the virgin forest. It's right there, waiting and preserved. If there's one thing that barns are in a different way than anything else, is a direct connection to our history.
As the farms became more productive, and prosperous, then the outside of the barn was sometimes decorated to reflect this.
Of course, it's traditional that a barn be red.
Well, it was inexpensive and farmers could make their own paint.
Barns in the 19th century were red because that was the cheapest paint that you could buy.
Now, the barns I grew up with were always gray.
You might paint your barn white to illustrate that you were doing just a tad better than they, because you could afford to paint your barn white.
Aesthetics was not a consideration necessarily in the painting of the barn, but aesthetics was completely a consideration in the way that your barn and your farmstead looked.
One of the ways of being competitive was to make sure that when you drove by that place, you got a good impression. You made sure that your barn was painted, your house was painted. Everything was neat and tidy, those would be the words. Coming right down to how carefully did the person pile his wood pile. My dad would often say, that guy's slack, that was the word. Because look at his wood pile. Well, gee whiz, he's going to burn it over winter anyway. What difference does it make? Well, he wasn't careful enough in putting it together. If the farmstead didn't look just as it ought to, there's got to be something wrong. Maybe they aren't getting along, man and wife. Oh, geez, that happens in the country too. Oh, were the sheets nice and white hanging on the clothesline? There are all these little symbols, and my dad and my mother knew every one of them, from wood piles to clotheslines to paint on the barn.
Everybody thinks cupolas are there because they were ventilators or brought in light, or this has nothing to do with it at all. It's look at me and how successful I am.
I talked to an old Pennsylvania Dutch guy, and I said, what's the root of all this? He says, just for pretty. Just for pretty.
There are farmers that have an artistic flair and want to do something a little different.
That particular type is an attempt to create a more efficient barn, basically. They tend to be larger, and they tend to be associated with farms that are more prosperous and more progressive.
Round barns, octagon barns, those were a statement. I mean, they were a statement that said, well, I'm not going to build just a regular barn. I'm going to build something special.
One of the true magics of a barn is that it's a complete sensory experience.
I love the smell of a barn, especially if it's a working barn.
When it's cold outside and you step into the barn, and the barn itself is relatively warm because we've got lots of cattle in there and their body heat is warming the barn up. And it's just a sensory bomb because, you know, it's the smell of cattle and moisture and shit. The complex smell of a barn permeates the barn, and once you've smelled it, whenever you smell it again, it brings it back.
One man can build a barn. He just can't put it up.
Building a barn is a shared work activity, just like threshing grain. So you're relying on your neighbors as part of a barn raising activity, because if you're going to be a good neighbor, and that's what the magazines of the period were saying, to be a good neighbor, you need to share work.
I have found some good early newspaper accounts of barn building. Often, friends and neighbors would show up, sometimes bringing their own tools to provide enough people power to erect those heavy timber frames.
One account that I've seen in the 1880s talks about the barn was put up by 8 o'clock and they danced till 4 in the morning.
We still are connected to that part of our culture. We're ready to put up our barn. Please come and join us. It wasn't just because they needed the help. It was because that's what made the barn part of the community.
Standing in that old barn like being in a big cathedral is not far from true, because many of the early barn builders also built the churches.
The first time I stepped in a big barn, it was like stepping into a cathedral or a tall ship. Until recently, they were the biggest things in the rural landscape. But the closest thing we have in this country to spirit of the builders and what they did.
Our barns are built just like the cathedrals in Europe were. Same type of construction.
The sounds in the old barn are church-like. It can be a spiritual experience in standing in a barn on an April day when the wind is talking to the barn and the barn is talking to you.